This is Duke University.
Thank you so much for inviting me to Duke, Claudia, and thank you all for coming. Thanks also to Del Williams, for helping me arrange my visit, and I've really enjoyed my day walking around your especially beautiful campus. It's really, really nice. I'm really excited to be sharing with you some material from my new book project about the rise and fall of a national Hispanic conservative movement between the 1960s and the 1990s. Latino conservatives became institutionally linked to the Republican Party with the founding of the Republican National Hispanic Assembly in 1967. I'll call it the RNHA for the rest of my talk. And that organization's stature is much diminished since the mid-1990s, in part because of divisive debates about California's Proposition 187. The breaking apart of a national movement embodied by the RNHA into smaller and more local pockets of Latino conservatives could leave us wondering how two Cuban-American senators captured national attention as candidates for president of the United States. But that present-day consideration is only a small part of what I'm interested in talking about today. I have several ways of explaining how I came to this project on Latino conservatism. One main reason has to do with the arguments that I've had with my paternal grandfather, Geraldo Cadava Jr., over the course of my lifetime. He's been a loyal Republican since the 1980 election when he voted for Ronald Reagan, who promised to lower his taxes. He worked in an Arizona silver mine where every penny counted, but he now mimics most talking points of the Republican Party and Fox News anchors. So my relationship with him really hits close to home. It made me think about how Latino conservatives are part of our communities and families, not outcasts or pariahs or sellouts as they tend to get portrayed. An issue that looms large for me then is to explain how Latino conservatism emerged from within Latino communities rather than apart from them. And doing so, I believe, complicates our understanding of the practice of ethnic identity and ethnic politics. Before I tell you about the Latin American roots about Latino conservatism, I want to say a little bit more about what I mean by Hispanic conservative movement and point to some of the historical questions that it raises. 1 year before the 1980 general election, in November 1979, 10 Republicans competed for their party's nomination. Most of them held the usual credentials: congressman, senator, former governor, former CIA director, and famous last names such as Reagan, Dole, and Bush. But among them stood a man named Benjamin Boxcar Ben Fernandez, pictured here. He was a 53-year-old Mexican-American born in 1925 in the rail yards of Kansas City. And both of his parents were undocumented immigrants from Mexico who were, quote, so poor that they had lived in a converted railroad boxcar where he was born, hence his nickname. When Fernandez was 5, he went to work with his family picking sugar beets in Michigan and Indiana, like many thousands of other migrant farm workers. And eventually he became the first Latino Republican ever to run for president of the United States. Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz were late to the party. Fernandez was a political unknown on the national level, but he was well regarded within the Republican Party establishment as a leader of grassroots campaigns to organize Latino conservatives in California, as a fundraiser for Nixon's, I always say Nixican because of the Mexican, Nixon's 1972 re-election campaign, and as a founder of the Republican National Hispanic Assembly. For many of us, the very idea of a man like Fernandez, a Hispanic conservative, defies logic. Take, for example, this year's Republican primary race. Donald Trump was a real estate mogul who had called Mexicans rapists, murderers, and thieves, and who kicked off his campaign by announcing his plan to deport 11 million Mexicans, all of who were here illegally, across the big, beautiful wall that he would build. And standing beside him on the debate stage were two Cuban Americans. One of them, Marco Rubio, said that his grandfather taught him to love America en español. And like so many Cuban Americans, his family's story of exile and their anti-Castro fulminations formed the spine of his own Bildungsroman. And their appearance together on the same stage revealed a central paradox of Latino conservatism and modern American conservatism in general. How could one Republican presidential candidate brazenly denigrate millions of people whose support many consider critical to winning the election? Latinos, after all, represent 17% of all Americans, while another similarly argued for border security, but also emphasized his family's immigrant roots, his bilingualism, and how he in some ways represented America's growing diversity. So Trump and Rubio represented two strains of conservatism, and the tension between them, many have observed, threatened to tear the party apart. So the Hispanic conservatives who became prominent Republicans from the 1960s forward all told similar stories about their background, their upbringing, and political formation. Whether their parents had emigrated from Latin America or were born in the United States, they all experienced economic hardship early in their lives, but through hard work and entrepreneurship, they found financial success. As you'll remember, Fernandez was born to undocumented immigrants who lived in a boxcar. Villalpando was the daughter of migrant workers, and then she rose to Treasurer of the United States. And Bañuelos liked to tell this story about how she arrived in the United States with a mere 36 cents in her pocket when she arrived in LA from Mexico. And then with earnings from her first job, she bought a small tortilla factory that made $36 on its first day of operation. And then as Treasurer of the United States, her salary was $36,000 per year. So she joked that 36 was her lucky number. Finally, Cuban Americans in the 1960s recalled how Castro had stripped their families of whatever wealth they had, so when they arrived in the United States, they had nothing. But through their own initiative, they started successful furniture stores, real estate companies, restaurants, and other businesses. So the individualistic drive to become wealthy, therefore, was central for Hispanic conservatives. Fernandez always said that he became a Republican when a friend from college told him that the Republican Party was for rich people. And he responded, "Sign me up. I've had enough of poverty." So despite disavowals of blackness and indigeneity in favor of whiteness, Latino conservatives usually broke with the Republican Party when its leaders lobbied for passage of racially discriminatory immigration legislation or measures that strengthened the border of the Americas in order to draw sharp distinctions between the United States and Latin America. In the 1970s, Congressman Luján didn't support the construction of the so-called tortilla curtain, the first steel fencing installed along the U.S.-Mexico border. And his RNHA co-founder, Fernando Oaxaca, in the mid-1990s, criticized California's Governor Pete Wilson for spearheading the campaign to pass Proposition 187. This is the state voter initiative that would have denied undocumented immigrants access to healthcare, education, medical services, and other public services. And in fact, the Republican National Hispanic Assembly really buckled under the weight of divisive debates over Proposition 187, as many Latino conservatives argued that they no longer had, quote, the permanent home in the GOP that Fernandez envisioned when the group was established. Immigration had become a kind of litmus test for Latinos gauging the Republican Party's support for them in general. And at the end of the day, Latino conservatives knew that their party could still cause them to experience indignity. In 1972, as the governor of California, Reagan hosted a dinner for Mexican President Echeverria that was, quote, laced with the leaders of Los Angeles' Mexican community. And as the performances that opened the gathering drew to a close, the Marine Corps band, marching from the ballroom where the dinner was held, played to the halls of the Montezumas. This was a song from the U.S.-Mexico War era sung by American troops as they conquered Mexico City. So as the Los Angeles Times put it, people in the audience sensitive to Latin feelings winced. 10 years later, in 1983, when a group of 30 Latino Republicans showed up to the White House for a meeting with Reagan in the Oval Office, they were subjected to a screening that many of them saw as discriminatory. And their home within the Republican Party had become an uninviting one. And this is the point that I want to end on, because for me it reveals what makes conservatism among Hispanics different from American conservatism in general. It's another important element about what's Hispanic about Hispanic conservatism. No matter how much they agree with the Republican Party's positions on the economy, on school choice, or traditional marriage, conservative Hispanics and the GOP will embrace one another awkwardly because of their often divergent views of hemispheric relations and divisive issues such as immigration and the border. And given the nexus of a rapidly growing Hispanic population and increasing nativism, these are two intertwined phenomena for sure, a history of Hispanic conservatism offers a glimpse of the fault lines that will shake American politics throughout the 21st century. And thank you, and I'll be happy to answer your questions.
I had one question that was just about numbers, because you have a tight focus on these individuals who are active in the Republican Party, but I'm curious about who's behind that. Like, are we talking about some entrepreneurial individuals who are carving out a place for themselves in the party, or are they actually really able to turn out votes in significant numbers and train others and, and bring others into the effort? That was one thing. And then the second question was about kind of the larger questions of racial formation and particularly relations with African Americans, which you don't talk about here at all, but like my own experience in the archives from these years is it's like the indispensable other, one way or another, whether there's a politics that's more about solidarity or more about competition. And it seems like in general, the more right-wing the operators like Mark Castillo and others, the more the effort to compete with African Americans and to position Mexican Americans as the kind of not African Americans, we are everything that they are not, at a moment when the Republican Party had been losing African Americans because of Goldwater's run in '64 and kind of moving to Southern segregationists. Right. So they're looking for another group, and Nixon starts cultivating Latino support in that context. And so I just wondered if you could say more about what's going on there as far as a kind of positioning of these Republican activists that you're talking about.
That's great. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And thank you for asking about numbers too. I'm so happy to be at Duke talking to you guys because I get to get lots of good ideas about how to do this. I mean, scaling up and down between these individuals up to the percentages of Latinos. I know both. I know the numbers and I know the individuals, and I am still trying to figure out how to bring them together. So the Republican Party from the 40s through 1972 won pretty consistently about 10 to 15% of the Latino vote. It was really in the 40s, and it was really in the 50s when they even started to count such a thing. But it's really with Nixon's re-election in 1972 through arguably the present, at least through George W. Bush, that the numbers rose a lot. They shot up to, depending on who the candidate was, but shot up to between 25 and 35%, or even 40 or 44% in George W. Bush's case. I would argue, we can talk about this later, I think he's more of a blip than representative of a ascendant Republican Party. But Nixon in 1972 won 35%. Reagan in 1980 won 35%, and then even did better in 1984. George H.W. Bush won about 30%. He's the only Republican president except for Ford and, well, actually Ford didn't sit for re-election. He's the only, or run for re-election. I'm getting tripped up. George H.W. Bush is the only Republican to do worse in his re-election campaign among Latinos than he did in his first year. So, short answer to your question, though, is that it was between 10 and 15% until 1968, and rose to between 25 and 35% from the 1970s through the 1990s. And then famously, George Bush won 40% in 2000, 44% in 2004. So they've been successful. And this relates to your, so that's millions of voters, right? That's millions of people. I don't know how to scale up and down, though. I still haven't quite figured out if I'm talking about trying to kind of take a snapshot of those millions of people and figure out who they are and what they're doing. I mean, some of them are the kind of evangelical voters that may have less in common with people like Martin Castillo or Benjamin Fernandez. And I don't know if haven't talked about them so far because they might complicate my argument about hemispheric relations, because they might be less attuned to hemispheric relations than these businessmen who are kind of conducting business. So maybe I just need to pay more attention, and that'll help me, attention to them, and that'll help me figure out how to go back and forth. There are millions of them, though. It relates to the question about African Americans because, Latinos are much more swing voters than African Americans in the period that I'm studying. You know better than I do, but it's not much more than 10% or something that Republicans win among African Americans. Is that right? So, what's that?
And less.
And less, yeah, exactly. So, yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, that's right. So, if you line those two facts up, that it's during the past 50 years or so, the African American vote has historically been about 10%. The Latino vote has ranged between 25 and 35%, depending in large part on just outreach efforts and a candidate's position on immigration. It fluctuates much more, so the Latino vote's a much greater swing vote. What I don't know, and part of why I'm so happy that someone like Brett Gadsden's coming to Northwestern, because he's working now writing a book on Nixon's, I can't remember if it's like the first black cabinet or second black cabinet. I'm going to be able to ask him some of these things. What I don't know is if either the party or its members themselves kind of siloed themselves from one another. Like, so African American Republicans, I should talk to Leah Wright Rigueur about this too, who wrote the Loneliness of the Black Republican. I don't know about how African American and Latino conservatives were working together or seeing their...
Just to clarify, I was not talking about cooperation and collaboration between Latino and Black conservatives, but about Latino conservatives positioning themselves to the Republican Party. It's like, we're not like those Black people.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of that rhetoric that I saw in sources. I don't know if you see it.
Yeah. Totally.
It's a rhetorical and a political strategy of position.
Yeah, of distantiation or whatever. That's the kind of thing that Brian Benken has written a wonderful book about in Dallas, where he has lots of leaders of LULAC in Dallas saying just terrible things about African Americans in Dallas in the 1920s and 30s. And I did see a lot of that in Republican National Hispanic Assembly papers in particular. And when they talk about it in the 70s and 80s, they're primarily using it as a reason that Latinos should move away from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, because they see that the Democratic Party has gone all in, really, with supporting African Americans, and therefore has turned its back on Latinos. And that's part of the argument that Latino Republicans try to use to recruit Latinos away from the Democratic Party, to say that the Democratic Party is the party that cares exclusively about African Americans and has consistently betrayed the Latino community. So that's how I've seen it kind of in the archive.